In the mid-1980s, Mel Gibson sat down with Australian TV presenter Ray Martin and said something at the time that sounded borderline heretical. Here it is.
Questions about this foreign debt and where this foreign debt's coming from. You get hold of this foreign debt to get us out of trouble. And then they have something called foreign aid, which is, it'd be okay if it was feeding starving children or something, but it's not. They're giving many millions to countries like Red China, North Vietnam, South Korea to develop steel industries. And they give this money to them interest-free. But you know who has to pay the interest on that money? The Australian taxpayer has to pay the interest on that money. And to add insult to injury, they are creating industries in competition with our own steel industry. Now, they're telling us from both sides to be more productive, stick together, get in front, be more productive, get ahead again, and at the same time, they're slipping a quid overseas to make sure that they successfully stifle our own industries.
You're obviously hot under the collar.
I am damn hot under the collar.
He argued that foreign aid wasn't charity. It was industrial self-harm, gutting Australian industry. He warned that the Australian taxpayer was paying money that was being used to establish steel and heavy manufacturing industries in Asia, specifically China, Vietnam and South Korea, which would inevitably compete directly with our Australian industries. His core point was so brutally simple. Australia was training, financing and enabling its future competitors, then acting surprised when domestic manufacturing collapsed. And at the time, this cut against the dominant narrative. Foreign aid was sold as moral, generous, progressive. Questioning it meant you were selfish, unsophisticated and a racist. Gibson wasn't attacking the people receiving the aid, he was attacking the policy logic. And of course, history has proved him right. And this is why it's considered prophetic now and why this clip went viral in the last week. This video is brought to you by the Australian Lobby Group. This is the only lobby group that's been designed for everyday Australians to get a voice in Canberra. If you increasingly feel that you have no representation through party politics, then the Australian Lobby Group is for you. The Australian Lobby Group doesn't take any foreign donations and represents you, the Australian workers, the Australian small to medium enterprises, the people that get up every day and keep paying the taxes that fund the government corruption that's wrecking this country. If you'd like to become a member, jump on the Australian Lobby Group website, donate, join, get in the fight with us. We'll see you this year as we push through and we make changes in our great country. For the last few decades, Australia's steel and manufacturing base has been hollowed out. China, South Korea, Vietnam dominate steel production and Australian exports only raw materials. Energy costs and regulation have finished off what trade policy then started. When you reach the we've hollowed out all of our manufacturing industries in Australia stage, like we're currently in, all that you're left with is the ability to create scarcity in your housing market, to keep pumping up the property Ponzi scheme, and then pump in more migrants like we do in Australia to make houses even more scarce and even more rare and even more unaffordable for everyday Australians. The more we hollowed out manufacturing, the more expensive we made energy, the worse things have become. The worst things have become, and it's as simple as that. And Mel Gibson could see that coming in the 80s. Governments now talk about sovereign capability as if it vanished by accident. Mel Gibson identified the problem before it was fashionable, before globalisation was questioned, and long before the political class admitted that there was a downside to offshoring our industries. And that's why this clip has been circulating today. Not because Mel Gibson isn't an economist, but because he saw the incentives clearly when others were drunk on moral vanity. And let's look closely at what happened to Australian steel in the last 30 years, because in the mid-1990s, Australia still had a real vertically integrated steel industry with large domestic blast furnace operations. We had a skilled workforce and apprenticeships. We had steel that was feeding construction, manufacturing, defence, rail and automotive. We had a strategic capability with major hubs that included Port Kembla and Whyalla in South Australia. Steel was never glamorous, but damn, it was foundational. It builds countries. But then what changed? In the late 1990s to the 2010s, we developed trade policy over strategy. And Australia embraced free trade absolutism. Tariffs came down, protections vanished, and steel was treated like bananas and t-shirts. Think about that. CEOs of almost every major fabrication, industrial business, commercial entity in Australia is telling you right now that energy has never been more expensive and that it's never been harder to do business than it currently is in Australia. Does that sound like a successful economy to you? Steel is strategic. It's not just commercial. It doesn't just have to make sense commercially. You need it to run your country. When we became obsessed with foreign aid and being a good player in the global community through the 80s and 90s, we essentially undermined the development of steel production in Australia and offshored everything. We helped build steel and heavy industry in countries that hate us. Exactly what Mel Gibson had warned us about. And those countries didn't just catch up to Australia's capacity, they exceeded us by miles. And of course, have a look where China is now. China didn't just outcompete Australia in a free market, it subsidised its steel heavily. It ignored all of the environmental regulations. It used our cheap coal and its own energy to produce tons and tons of steel, millions of tons, and then it flooded the global market to wipe out any competition. Australia never stood a chance against cheap Chinese production. And then of course, what was left of our industry, energy costs killed the rest of it. Australian steelmakers have been hit with rising electricity prices, carbon policy uncertainty, network charges, and green tape without global parity. We've hamstrung and destroyed our own industries just so that we can say we're a good global citizen. Because steelmaking is energy intensive. Australia made it expensive, and that was game over for us. We were cooked at that point. The collapse phase of this story in the last 15 years, the illusion that things like green hydrogen would help us make more steel, all of that falling apart. And at this point, we've stopped making steel from pretty much scratch. We've become a quarry with ports. Of course, Australia still does have steel production, but not like people think. What we have is limited domestic primary production with a heavy reliance on imported steel and steel slab with very vulnerable supply chains. We have zero surge capacity in the middle of a crisis. And you know, BlueScope Steel largely survives because it pivoted, it offshored a lot of its production to Asia and America, and it learned to live inside Australia's policy mess, unlike a chunk of other businesses. Whyalla Steelworks survives because the government can't afford to let it die for political reasons. And it's now a sovereign risk issue, not a business one. You know, the brutal truth is Australia didn't lose steel by accident. We chose moral signalling over industrial realism again and again. And once again, we chose cheap imports over long-term capability. And Australia always chooses ideology over physics. And we never go past a moment to choose global virtue over national interest. The same political class that dismantled our steel industry now talks about sovereign capability and resilience, and made in Australia, after they spent 30 years dismantling it. And of course, they'll blame the government before them, but we all know it's the same uniparty blob. Steel is the backbone of defence, infrastructure and housing, and we used to understand that in Australia. And of course, then we outsourced it. Heart-wrenching to think that we gave away our steel industry smiling, clapping and telling ourselves we were advanced while dismantling the very things that made us safe. Australia convinced ourselves that the world was a giant dinner party and not a contest, and that the ships would always arrive on time, that energy would always be cheap somewhere else, that wars were things that other people had in shitty countries with worse values and worse planning. We replaced factories with feelings, strategy with slogans, and resilience with crappy press releases. A nation that can't make its own steel is a nation that can't defend itself. It can't rebuild after shocks, and it can't stand upright when supply chains snap and alliances wobble. And yet we were told that this was progress, that dependence was sophistication, that outsourcing our backbone and our industries was moral maturity. Would you rather be alive in 2025 or in Mel Gibson's 1985? Think about that. Was the world a better place then or now? Was the world a better place 10 years ago in 2015 than it is in 2025? Yes, in my opinion it was. Was it better in 2005 than it was in 2015? Yes, it was. The further back you go, the better it was. It was a better place. It was a better time. We made things. We had more money. We had more opportunity. Businesses weren't smashed into the ground for trying to have a go. What you've got now is an economy that's completely corrupted by the population Ponzi scheme. Ask yourself this one question. Will Australia be a better place in 2035 than it is in 2025? And if you can't say yes to that, then you're on my team. You're on my team. And you know as well as I do that the shitification of Australia is only going to amplify and get worse as we go forward. The world didn't get kinder, it got sharper, faster and more brutal while we were busy congratulating ourselves for being nice. We stripped out the hard stuff, the unfashionable stuff and the things that matter when everything goes wrong, and then we act shocked when everything started going wrong. History doesn't care about intentions, it only records outcomes, and right now the record reads like this. A wealthy country, rich in resources, strategically asleep, mistaking comfort for security and hoping, always hoping, that the bill for its naivety never comes due. Hope is not a strategy, folks, and dangerous times don't wait for countries that can't remember how to be serious players. It's time for Australia to stand up. We need to end the shitty trade agreements that we're in, consider tariffs to protect our industries, and start thinking about making things that are real instead of pretend transitional energy projects that are going nowhere and enriching the pockets of people that don't give a fuck about your country.